Should you buy a classic Porsche? No! We bought this 1987 911 Cabriolet in March of 2021. Now, for those of you counting, it is now March of 2022, which means we've owned this wonderful 911 for a full year, but we've had it in our possession for a grand total of like a month. It's been broken in the shop for 11 of the 12 months. My favorite channel on YouTube is a channel called Hoovies Garage, and it's a phenomenal channel. If you haven't seen what Tyler does over at Hoovies Garage, you can just leave this video now because he's way better at this than I'll ever be. But he buys these kind of cool, quirky, obscure classics, and then he's got a gentleman called the Car Wizard who then fixes them up for him, and like it's done in a couple of videos, and it looks phenomenal. Like, it looks like it's a great ownership experience, and well, you quickly realize how much talent that whole process really takes, and maybe how much talent that clearly I'm missing, because we bought this 1987 911. You know, it was a running and driving car. It was a little scruffy around the edges, but we thought we got a good deal on it. $36,000. And everyone online was like, oh no, you idiot, that's too cheap. It's gonna have all sorts of problems. And we're like, we'll figure it out. You know, we'll figure it out. Well, we have figured some of it out, but it's taken pretty much a full year. And the price has been eye-watering to get this car sorted. $16,000, 16 grand, and it still looks pretty much the same as when we bought it a year ago. It still drives pretty much the same as it did when we bought it a year ago. $16,000 were into this car on top of the 36 grand we paid for it. Now, granted, 36 is pretty cheap for a rust-free, clean title, air-cooled 911 with under 100,000 miles, but now we're in it like what? I don't even want to do the math. 36 plus 16. 52 grand. What happened? Not like all responsible potential classic car purchasers. We did take this for a long test drive before we handed over the money, and it actually ran and drove pretty well. It's got a newer clutch in it. The engine didn't smoke. It seemed to pull strong. Oil pressure was good. It idled well. Whoopee! So we paid the guy $36,000, and then 3 days later we went to get it emissions tested. All was well, and then it like just died, randomly died. Emissions people started it back up, and whoopee, passed emissions. Gotta love Colorado emissions. Anyways, brought it back to our offices in Boulder here, and it would just die randomly at like 5 to 10 minute intervals, and it would just be totally off the wall random. So I did some digging on the forums, and people said, well, there's this little relay under the seat called a DME, which controls part of the fuel injection system. Replace that, plopped a new one in there, didn't fix the problem. So we took this car to the shop, which the previous owner had used in the past, and he said he had good experiences with them. Apparently they had the 911 guy, and he's like, oh yeah, we can get it fixed. So he dove into the wiring, which apparently is a mess. He dove into like the fuel pump, and like nothing was fixing it. It would just keep randomly dying. So that was at that shop for a few weeks. We also had him dive a little bit into the top, which turned out to be non-functioning as well. That pre-purchase part didn't quite register in our brains to try the top, but we paid that shop $2,600, but quite honestly, they didn't fix much on the car, and it would still die randomly. So $2,600 later, we were still at stage one. So after that experience, we said, well, we got to find a different shop, and we took it to another shop relatively local to the area, which is very well established with fixing Porsches. And I was doing a bunch of Googling in the meantime, and I read that, you know, maybe the solders can fail on the computer. So I ran it past the guys at the shop, and they're like, yeah, that actually sounds pretty probable. And sure enough, I was right. I was right about something. I didn't fix it because, you know, I'm a kind of inept with anything in terms of turning wrenches and screwdrivers or whatever, but they did. So they sent out the computer, they got a new one. It actually has like a little bit of a chip tune in it, which was supposed to make it quicker. I don't know if that actually has happened, but it does now have a new computer in it, and it runs and drives brilliantly. Now that was pretty expensive, but we had a car that ran and drove nicely, but an in-op convertible top, and it was 100% our fault. We should have been more diligent on trying the top. We asked the guy, and he's like, oh, I don't put the top up because sometimes it gets stiff in the cold, and it was March in 2021, it was very cold, and we're like, all right. So after buying it, naturally, I tried to put the top up, and like it started to work, and then it made this terrible grinding noise, and then like the motor seized. And that started one of the biggest sagas I have ever experienced in my automotive career, because as it turns out, this top has had quite a terrible life. I think at some point what probably happened is something probably went a little wonky in it, and someone like forced it into the down position, so they yanked it down, and what that did was essentially break the motors away from the body, so the weld snapped, which meant that the top was completely misaligned, nothing worked, and basically the whole mechanism from a motor standpoint had to be replaced. I think one of the motors was fried as well, and it was just an extremely long, labor-intensive, and painful process. And the net result is actually, we don't even have a new top. It still is the top that came with the car. Luckily, it was in pretty good shape. But it was hugely painful. And then of course you had like the COVID problems with the chip shortages, and all of that came into play. And it resulted in an extremely long process to get the top fixed, and also super pricey. Now beyond the top, there were a couple of other things we had that shop do, which turned out pretty cool actually. So first up, the radio. This had some horrible 90s aftermarket deck, and we actually went with a really cool system. It's sold through Porsche, so it's not some Car Toys unit. It's actually a Porsche part that looks exactly like the original, but it's got a little tiny screen in it. It's got Apple CarPlay, it's got Bluetooth audio. It's fantastic. It was really expensive. I think it was over $1,000 just for the unit. And then they had a professional install it and get the speakers working. That was well worth the time, I think, even though that was a big chunk of the 16 grand we spent on the car. And then the steering wheel. This had the worst steering wheel I've ever seen. It looked like a what did it look like? It looked like a Red Robin arcade plastic steering wheel, made in Italy, as it turns out, based on the lettering on the back. But steering wheel had to be replaced. Got the new steering wheel in, and then issues with the hub, getting the hub to work on this new steering wheel. And then of course we had issues with the turn signal stock after that, but it's all sorted out, looks great, feels great. Pretty happy with it. Maybe we should have gone with the original design, but this is such a high quality unit. My dad definitely splurged on the steering wheel. So that's good. Radio's really good. And yeah, $16,000 later, in like 11 months, we got ourselves a 911. So what did we learn from this whole experience? Well, obviously, you guys in the comments were probably right in a big way, right? You want to buy the best version of a vehicle you can afford, and if you can't afford it, probably shouldn't buy it. And certainly spending the whatever $52,000 now on a good one of these would have been a much better choice from a time standpoint. But the other thing too, and I have talked to a bunch of Porsche people about this whole experience, and they're kind of right, like, it's an old Porsche. You know, even if we had spent $65,000 on a really good 87 911, I mean, there's still a chance you bring it home and someone overfills the oil at one point in its life, and then the crank seal blows, and then the engine needs to come out, right? Like, they're just expensive cars to maintain, and you just have to kind of go into that mindset that, yeah, it's gonna break and it's gonna be very expensive. And unless you're really talented with the wrenches and you have the space and the time to do the work yourself, you're gonna be paying a lot to keep these cars on the road. And I mean, at the end of the day, this is still a really cool car. Now, we have done some research into this car's kind of history. There's this cool program where you can run the VIN, and they tell you exactly what this car had and the color it was new from the factory. And this has certainly been repainted. I think it was like this kind of neat teal green when it was new. And I don't think any of the wide body stuff is original per se. And usually that would really piss me off, but it's super well done. So all of this is steel. Side stills are steel. These flares, like, I mean, it's all real metal. None of this is fiberglass. So even though maybe it wasn't quite original to the car, it does look phenomenal. It's been really well done. And this venting here, it's the same venting you'd find on like a slant nose. So it's kind of like a slant nose from the A-pillar back. I do believe though that the whale tail is original, which is very, very cool. Now, of course, this isn't a 911 Turbo, because those are hundreds of thousands of dollars now. By the way, if Jerry Seinfeld is watching, he's not watching. But if you are, send me an email. I'd love to drive a 930 Turbo, one of these cars one day. It's one of my ultimate dreams. I don't think I'll ever be able to accomplish that, but yeah, this is original and it looks cool. It doesn't have the turbo engine, but at least it's got the turbo look. And apart from that, like, it genuinely is a very cool car. I do have to say, it drives nicely. If you wanted to daily drive a classic car, this would be one of my choices, because it's just a tank. It's everything's heavy, everything feels really well made, and I think, knock on Porsche, that it's going to be fairly reliable from here on out, because they do last just the test of time, hundreds of thousands of miles in a lot of cases. And it's fun to drive too. Fairly lightweight car, not a huge amount of horsepower. I think these were 210 rated from the factory, somewhere in that number. And of course we're at elevation and it's 35 years old, so 150 horsepower now maybe at this elevation. But it's a fun car to rev out. The steering's good, the brakes are good. Wheels are terrible. Look at these horrible wheels. That's going to be the next thing to go, but we need to save some pennies for a bit because this car has been quite expensive. So going back to the original question, should you buy an old Porsche? I mean, I was super definitive in the beginning, but if you can afford it and you really do need to have a lot of money left over for maintenance, they are fantastic cars. They really are special. I understand why people love them. Maybe I don't understand the $70,000, $80,000 love for like a standard 911, but it's there and people do pay that kind of money for these cars. All right, start of year 2. Hopefully we can get more than 400 or 500 miles on the odometer compared to the previous year. Guys, thank you so much for watching and for making this happen. As always, check out TFL Car, TFL Truck, and TFL-Studios.com for all the latest and greatest in new and used car reviews.